If you're a parent, teacher, or school leader, and you're sick and tired of the frustration, anger, and unfair treatment of children at high risk in our public schools, then perhaps it's time for all of us to do something about it. In this podcast, Dr. Almitra Berry brings you tips, tools, strategies, and tactics to build successful solutions while touching, moving, and inspiring all of us to transform our schools so that every child thrives. Here's your host, Dr. Berry.
At the intersection of education and politics, there is a deeply orchestrated and generously financed campaign that is unfolding across this country. A sweeping surge of obscure financial resources that's flowing into states controlled by the Republican Party. This surge of money is driven by a precise mission to erode democratic principles through electoral interference and the privatization of our public schools. Where I live here in Texas, billionaires from both within and beyond state borders are inundating our political landscape with a seemingly endless amount of money. They use intermediary entities as conduits to channel substantial campaign funds towards politicians from, I'm going to have to say it, from both sides. Welcome back, Equity Wars. Thanks for tuning in to another episode focused on the intersection of education and politics here on the 3E Podcast. Now, I promised you more than once. Today's the day. This is the episode. Let's talk about school vouchers. Now, school vouchers are like golden tickets. They offer parents public funding, taxpayer dollars, to send their children to private and religious schools. Now, in the pursuit of knowledge and progress, I do strive to provide you with balanced reporting. I like to give you both sides of a discussion, even though I am, in this case and always, on the side of educating children, all children, and making sure that children of color and those otherwise marginalized are not forgotten, harmed, damaged, or left behind. And vouchers are a complex and highly debated issue when it comes to education policy, and understanding both sides is crucial for anyone who is really interested in the future of our public schools. So here's the lowdown. I'm going to give you the arguments both for and against vouchers, 4 arguments for each side. So let's start with the arguments for school voucher programs. Number 1, supporters say that vouchers increase school choice, that they break down the barriers of zip codes and income levels and allows parents to choose the schools that best suit their child's needs. Argument number 2, proponents of school vouchers say that they improve educational outcomes, that the competition from private schools will give public schools a friendly nudge to up their game and lead to a better education for all. Argument number 3 is that they have parental control over education. Vouchers do empower parents to take the reins of their children's education, and it enables parents to select schools that align with their values and beliefs. Argument number 4 is the cost reduction. So interestingly, educating a child through a voucher program, proponents say, costs less than in a public school. And that can be appealing from a fiscal perspective. So those 4 arguments for increased school choice, improve educational outcomes, parental control, and cost reduction. Those are the 4 in favor of school vouchers. Now, 4 arguments against school vouchers. Number 1 is an argument about diversion of resources from public schools. Critics of school vouchers say that vouchers siphon off resources, particularly financial resources, take those away from public schools, and that potentially harms the quality of education for the children who remain in the public school system. Argument number 2 is a lack of accountability. When private schools receive vouchers, they are not necessarily generally not held to the same standards as public schools. They are not public schools. So that potentially results in lower educational outcomes for the children that are in private schools. No accountability. Argument number 3 is a violation of separation of church and state. Now, separation of church and state, I've talked about that before, and it's a very careful distinction. But there are voucher programs that are allowing taxpayer money to be used for religious schools. And some view this as crossing that line of the government endorsing or promoting a specific religion. And then argument number 4 is that vouchers would make inequality greater. Voucher opponents say that voucher programs worsen inequality because it does allow wealthier families to opt out of public schools and leaves behind those students who cannot afford a private education. So those are the big arguments for on each side. Now, let me give you my humble opinion. My top 10 reasons why vouchers are harmful to marginalized learners. And you know what? While I'm doing this, I'm going to address some of the flawed arguments against charters while I'm at this, because a lot of times people are conflating private schools and charter schools. So my number one is the argument or the case that vouchers leave less money for public schools. Vouchers will take away money from public schools that need it the most. We already know that schools filled with children of color are the lowest funded schools in the country. Vouchers will take money away from those schools. It also makes it harder then for marginalized learners to get a good education. Now, those people who try to conflate charter schools with private schools, charter schools are public funded schools. They get their funding in the same way that public schools do, and that is by the child, but they are not private schools. So they're not taking any money away from public schools. Most of the time, charter schools are controlled and governed by a local school district. So just to clear that up a little bit. Argument number two, or my reason number two, is selection bias. Private schools have the choice to decline a student. They may not, or they may choose to not accept a child of color, a child who does not speak English as a primary language, a child who is low income. They have the choice of who they accept and who they don't. And that leaves these children who are marginalized because of race or culture or language or even learning ability, which is a different number for me, leaves them with fewer options. Now, charter schools, not the same thing. Charter schools do not have selective enrollment. Charter schools are public schools. If a child wants to attend a charter, as long as there is space, the charter has to give them that spot. So big difference there. All right, number three is limited accountability. Private schools are not under the same accountability measures as public schools are. When they get that money, they don't necessarily have to follow the same rules as your public schools and your charter schools have to. That means that there's less oversight. And that means for some of our more marginalized children who might get a voucher and choose and be accepted in a private school, that they may have worse results than they did before because there's no check on bias. There's no check on providing services for children who are marginalized. That was my number three. Number four is segregation. And voucher programs can and will contribute to segregation. They will allow families that already have the money to send their children to private school a little extra money to do so. And so wealthier families or families that are on the higher end of the middle class will now have an opportunity to leave a public school that may be struggling. So who's left behind? Learners of color, learners of lower wealth, otherwise marginalized learners, increasingly in schools that are isolated and underfunded. My number five is accessibility. Transportation, getting to school. Voucher programs for some children, while that might be attractive, how do they get there? How do they get to a good private school that they might be accepted at that's not in their neighborhood, that's not on a bus line, and particularly if their family, parents, caregivers, whoever it is that they're living with, don't have a vehicle to get them to school and to pick them up from school on time. Just getting there limits their educational options. My number six is curriculum. Private schools don't have to follow inclusive or culturally diverse curricula. That means that you may have more marginalized learners who have limited exposure to a well-rounded curriculum. Already, we have book bans and PragerU materials being used in public schools. But right now, with public schools, at least there's an avenue to challenge that, where that avenue does not exist in a private school. My number seven is special needs learners. Some private schools, again, can simply choose to not enroll a child that has special needs. That's not true of charters. A charter school who's presented with a child with special needs has to enroll that child. Some private schools don't have the resources to help learners with special needs. So what happens to these kids, again, those most frequently marginalized or who need additional supports. My number 8 is that that vouchers will erode the public school system as a whole, and that includes charter schools. If you have a significant shift of students from public schools moving into private schools because of vouchers, what's left in our public schools? Sometimes what's left of our public schools even, sometimes our public schools are community hubs for marginalized populations. Sometimes our public schools are the one place in a community that people can come together. And we are looking at losing, and we're already losing public schools. There are school closures across the country due to declining enrollment. What happens as more and more students are siphoned away? My number 9 is a lack of transparency. Private schools don't have to disclose important information about their practices. Their curriculum does not have to be publicly reviewed. There are not always going to be opportunities for parents to see everything that's going on in that school in order to make informed choices for their children. And my number 10, and this is a biggie, is that vouchers will just make the socioeconomic gaps that already exist wider. Vouchers make a significant difference between rich and poor students because families with more money can go to better private schools. And since private schools don't have to limit what they charge for tuition, if they are starting to get a population that maybe they don't want to serve, they have the opportunity to raise their tuition and make it inaccessible for marginalized learners. So what's that tuition look like? Well, I did some digging to prepare for this and found that the highest K-12 private school tuition that I could find in the United States was $54,000 per year. Yep, kindergarten, $54,000 per year. In Houston, where I live, the average tuition for K-12 private school is $24,225 per year. $24,000 per year per child. In Philadelphia, it's roughly $12,000. North Carolina, I found $10,000. There are some parts of the country where private school costs less than $5,000 per year in tuition, but you can see there's a big difference there. So those are my 10 reasons that vouchers could potentially harm our public school system as a whole and specifically do greater damage to marginalized learners who are already struggling. And it's important to consider this as an equity issue in educational policy. Now, I make no bones about it. I am pro-educating every single child. I am definitely in favor of making sure that our public school systems support and educate the most marginalized children. I am pro-public education, all public education, and yes, that includes charter schools who are accountable for funding, for curriculum, for admissions, for enrollment, just like your regular public schools. Now, yes, charter schools do have some flexibility in their curriculum, and no, they don't have to be union shops. They may not have to have licensed teachers, but you know what? In most states, there are waivers that are granted to public school districts all the time, allowing them to hire teachers that do not have a certificate to teach. In my first teaching assignment, I was still in teacher school. I did not have a teaching certificate. I had an emergency credential, which meant that I had a bachelor's degree and I passed a reading test. And just in case you missed it, there is a worldwide shortage of teachers right now. In some places, anybody without a felony conviction who's willing to show up and teach may be standing in front of your child's classroom as a substitute. Now, I'm not in favor of a system that provides public money, welfare for the wealthy, for private schools, and certainly not when it goes to people who are already paying tens of thousands of dollars to send their child to their school of choice. So what's happening? Well, in a few select states, of course. I'll touch on my faves because, hey, Texas and Florida are the gifts that just keep on giving when it comes to equity. In Texas, Governor Greg Abbott did keep his promise to call legislators into a special session to get his voucher program. What he wants is $8,000 a year, a voucher for each child to pay for private schools, including religious ones. Fortunately, in the Texas House, there's a group of both Republican and Democrats who come from rural communities that have managed to stop this from becoming law. Now, a bill has made it through the Senate, but I want you to recognize that rural Republicans and Democrats who recognize that in some places they have 1 and 2 school county systems. That's it, 2 schools in the county. They're small systems. Vouchers don't help them. And it siphons money away from their schools that are already small and struggling. Now, my other favorite state, Florida, in March of this year, the governor there, Ron DeSantis, signed House Bill 1 into law, and it has no restrictions based on how much money a family makes or how many students are in the program. Almost any Florida family with a child in elementary, middle, or high school can get a voucher worth the same amount of money that the local public school would get if the child went there. Now, families in Florida can use their voucher to pay for private school. They can use it to homeschool their child as long as they follow the state rules. There are even some new education savings accounts. That is something that Texas is looking at as well, where the money can be used for other school-related things. Now, I do have a guest scheduled to come on who is a member of the Florida State Legislature and a former Hillsborough County School Board's trustee, so make sure you stay tuned for our chat about education in the Sunshine State. I told you I'd bring you guests. In Pennsylvania, next state, the Senate there agreed to set aside $100 million a year for a voucher that would support some students from the poorest parts of Pennsylvania to go to private schools. The governor there, who is a Democrat, supports his voucher plan that's called the Lifeline Scholarship Program, but some of his fellow Democrats in the legislature don't seem too excited about it. And then over in North Carolina, we have lawmakers that are thinking about making private school vouchers even bigger. And that means that more public schools could lose a lot more money, maybe estimated even into the hundreds of millions of dollars. And while, yes, there are states that have rejected some voucher programs, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities reports that at least half of the 50 states, are considering school voucher bills that undermine the promise of public schooling. Now, maybe your public school system is struggling, maybe it's not. I've taught in struggling schools with a history of poor performance, and I have worked in teaching and in coaching to turn schools around. But even if they're struggling, is giving money to wealthy families to remove them from schools the answer? Is dangling that carrot of taking a voucher so you can send your child to private schools only to find out that the voucher doesn't cover half or a third of the cost of that private school? What does that do? Now, parents do and always will have choice. There are magnet programs. There are schools of choice in public school districts across the country. And the reasons to fix our public schools far outweigh the elitist goal of vouchers, using your taxpayer money to support, in many states, the wealthiest families who are already spending their plentiful money for their choice of schools. If you truly believe in equity, if you are an equity warrior, then take a really close look at what will happen in your community if vouchers are made available. Now, if you'd like to book me to speak at your next event, check out my new website, bookdrberry.com. That's bookdrberry.com. And then join me again next week. Continue to connect with me on social using the links down in the notes. Email your questions, topics, and requests to info@askdrberry.com. I'll bring you answers and experts to address those topics. Don't worry about the things you cannot change. Change the things you can no longer accept. And I'll see you next time.
That's it for today's episode of the 3E Podcast. Head over to iTunes and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week that posts a review on iTunes will win a chance in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 value private VIP day with Dr. Berry herself. Be sure to head over to 3epodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Dr. Berry's gift. Then join us on the next episode.